They say storms take what you love. That night, the storm brought Jake Sullivan what he'd forgotten he was allowed to have: responsibility. A former Navy SEAL hiding in Wyoming, he lived by one rule: don't open the door to anything you can't lose. But just after midnight, the wind paused, and a soft scrape answered the silence. Jake swung the door wide. Two ice-crusted German Shepherd puppies blinked up at him, trembling, stubbornly alive. The smaller one lifted a paw and tapped the frame, like a knock, and Jake's frozen heart answered. Miracles don't shout.
Where did you two come
they
from?
whisper.
There you go, little
Before
ones.
we begin, tell us where you're
All
watching
dry
from.
now.
And if this story touches
and
your
warm by
heart,
the fire.
please subscribe for more. A blizzard smothers the Wyoming mountains, erasing roads and sound. In a lone cabin at the forest edge, wind claws at the walls while a wood stove fights the cold. Jake Sullivan sat in the glow of the stove like it was the last safe thing left on Earth. The cabin was small, built for function, not comfort. Rough beams, a scarred table, shelves of canned food he'd stocked as if preparing for a siege. On the table, beside a mug of coffee gone cold, lay a tarnished Trident coin from his SEAL days. He kept it there the way some men kept a wedding ring, not to show it off, but to prove something had once been real. Outside, Wyoming had turned into a whiteout. The storm didn't fall the way snow usually did. It attacked, wind-driven sheets that swallowed the pines and flattened the world into one brutal color. The windows shuddered in their frames. Every few minutes, the roof creaked under a fresh load like the cabin was deciding whether to hold or give up. Jake listened to those sounds the way he used to listen to rotor blades in the dark, measuring distance, scanning for change, waiting for the moment something went wrong. He told himself this was what he wanted. No voices, no questions, no, "How are you holding up?" from people who didn't know what the words could cost. Out here, silence was clean. Silence didn't ask him why he was the one who came home. Afghanistan had given him the kind of memory you couldn't scrub out. A mission in the mountains, a split-second decision, a radio call swallowed by rock and chaos. Then the aftermath. Names on a list, a debriefing room that smelled like stale coffee and guilt, a handshake that felt like a verdict. 12 years in teams had trained him to move toward danger without thinking. Coming home had taught him a new skill: how to stand still while the world moved on without him. He had tried cities, tried crowds, tried the polite distance of people who were afraid of what a broken soldier might say if you looked him in the eye too long. Eventually, he'd driven until the roads thinned and the mountains rose, until the last gas station fell behind him and the forest swallowed the rest. The cabin wasn't punishment. He told himself it was recovery, a place to breathe without anyone watching. The wind slammed the porch once, hard enough to rattle the doorknob. Jake didn't flinch. He'd learned not to waste adrenaline on weather. He took a sip of the cold coffee anyway, bitter, grounding, then stared into the stove where flames curled around split pine. His knees ached the way they did when storms rolled in. Old injuries, old reminders. That was when he heard it. Not the wind, not the house settling. Something smaller, softer, a scrape, then another, hesitant, uneven, like a hand that didn't know whether it was allowed to ask. Jake's spine stiffened. The cabin sat miles from town. No neighbors, no reason for anyone to be out in this kind of storm unless they were lost, desperate, or dangerous. He set the mug down without a sound and stood. The movement was automatic, muscle memory dragging him upright as his eyes tracked the door, the windows, the shadows in the corners. Again. A faint scratching, followed by a thin, broken whimper. His pulse climbed, not with fear, but with a sudden, unwanted concern. He grabbed the flashlight from the hook by the door, then paused, hand hovering over the bolt. For a second, he considered ignoring it. Let the storm handle whatever was outside. Let the world stay out. But the whimper came again, weaker this time, and something inside him, some old instinct that had once hauled strangers out of wreckage, refused to let his hand move away. Jake unlatched the bolt and pulled the door open. Snow punched into the cabin, a cold slap that stole the warmth in one breath. The beam of his flashlight cut through swirling white and landed on two tiny shapes crouched on the porch boards. German shepherd puppies. No more than 6 weeks old. Their fur, black and tan beneath the frost, was crusted with ice like they'd been dipped in winter itself. Their paws looked too big for their bodies, splayed awkwardly as they tried to stand. The larger pup held its ground, trembling hard but upright, ears half-folded, eyes locked on Jake's face as if memorizing it. The smaller one pressed against its sibling, shivering so violently its teeth clicked. Then, the smaller pup lifted one paw and tapped the door frame, once, like a knock it had seen somewhere else. Jake's throat tightened. He'd carried grown men off mountains. He'd watched blood sink into sand. But this was desperation without armor. Pure need, pure trust, aimed at the one door that might open. He crouched slowly. "Where did you come from?" His voice sounded rough, unused. The bigger pup took a step forward and slipped, legs folding. The smaller pup tried to follow and nearly face-planted into the snow. That was enough. Jake scooped them up, one in each arm. They were so cold it scared him. Tiny bodies stiff from exposure, hearts fluttering fast under fur and ice. He kicked the door shut with his boot and carried them straight to the stove. An old wool blanket lay folded near the hearth. He spread it and set them down gently, then grabbed a towel and began rubbing with careful, brisk strokes, the way you warmed a casualty without shocking the system. Steam rose as the ice melted. The pups whimpered, not in protest, but in relief. "Easy," Jake murmured, surprised by how the word came out. "Easy, little warriors." He stripped off his own heavy jacket and wrapped them inside it, the fabric swallowing them whole. Their shivering didn't stop right away, but it slowed, minute by minute, until the bigger pup's head dropped against the blanket, eyes fluttering. The smaller one pressed closer, nose tucked beneath its sibling's chin like it was anchoring itself. Jake rummaged through the cabinets until he found an old can of chicken broth. He warmed it on the stove, poured a little into a shallow bowl, then set it on the floor. The smaller pup sniffed, hesitated, and started lapping with weak, trembling licks. The bigger pup followed, more guarded, but just as hungry. Jake sat down on the floor without realizing he was doing it. Cross-legged, close enough to feel their tiny bodies radiating heat back into the room. When they finally curled together, drowsy and breathing steadier, he reached out and let the bigger pup sniff his knuckles. The pup didn't bite. It leaned in, trusted. "You're a shadow," Jake whispered, watching how it kept its body angled toward the door even as it fought sleep. Then he looked at the smaller one, the clumsy little fighter that kept trying to sit up even when its legs wobbled. "And you," he exhaled, almost a laugh, "you're Blaze." The smaller pup made a squeak that could have been a bark. Jake felt his face shift, muscles remembering how to form something like a smile. Outside, the storm kept screaming at the cabin. Inside, for the first time in a long time, the silence wasn't empty. It was alive. And when Jake finally glanced back at the porch through the frosted window, he saw what made his stomach drop. 2 lines of tiny paw prints ended at his door. No tracks led back into the blizzard. Only a choice that had already been made, by them, and now, whether he admitted it or not, by him. The next morning, the cabin smelled like wood smoke and warm broth instead of loneliness. Jake woke with a stiff neck and a stranger's kind of worry in his chest. He rose quietly and set another log in the stove, as if a smaller life depended on the flame staying steady, because it did. Shadow and Blaze blinked awake beneath his jacket, 2 little heads lifting in unison. Shadow sat first, still wobbly but alert, eyes tracking the room like a sentry. Blaze tried to stand, slipped, then scrambled up again as if embarrassed to be caught falling. Jake found himself watching their balance, their breathing, their gums, running a mental checklist he hadn't used on anyone in years. "Okay," he muttered, more to himself than them. "We do this right." He warmed a fresh bowl of broth, added a bit of softened bread, and set it down. Blaze dove in like it was the best thing on earth. Shadow ate slower, pausing between licks to glance toward the door. Jake noticed it and felt a flicker of something like respect. A pup that small shouldn't already know how to guard. But out there, in that storm, maybe they'd learned fast. Jake was rinsing the bowl when a different sound reached him, cleaner than claws on wood. A knock. Human. Careful. As if whoever stood outside wasn't sure they'd be welcome. His body reacted before his mind did, shoulders tightening, breath shallow. That old reflex. Identify, assess, control. He stepped to the window and peeled back the curtain a fraction. A woman stood on his porch, bundled in a thick brown coat with a scarf wrapped high under her chin. Snow clung to her boots. Her silver hair was braided neatly over one shoulder, and she held a wicker basket like a peace offering. She didn't look like trouble. She looked like someone who had lived long enough to stop being impressed by a man's silence. Jake opened the door a crack. "Yeah?" Her eyes met his without flinching. "Morning," she said, voice warm but measured. "Jake Sullivan, right?" He didn't answer right away, which was answer enough. "I'm Margaret Collins," she continued. "Most folks call me Maggie." She lifted the basket slightly. "I saw your chimney smoking after the storm. Figured you were alive. Thought I'd bring a few things." Jake's gaze flicked to the basket, then back to her. "You shouldn't be out in this." Maggie's mouth curved, not quite a smile, more like a decision. "I've been out in worse. May I?" Jake stepped aside without meaning to. The gesture felt strange, like opening the cabin wasn't just letting in air, but letting in the world. Maggie entered, stamping snow from her boots. The cabin was plain. Stove, cot, table, a few battered field manuals on a shelf. Her eyes moved over the space with quiet understanding, not judgment. Then she saw the puppies. Her face softened immediately. She crouched, hands still gloved, and let Shadow sniff her knuckles. Shadow didn't growl. He leaned in. Blaze wiggled forward, tail wagging so hard his back end swayed. "Well," Maggie breathed, "that explains the light I thought I saw." She looked up at Jake. "How long have you had them?" "Since last night," he said. "And they're alive because you acted." She didn't say it like praise. She said it like a fact. "Good." She unpacked the basket with the efficiency of someone who'd spent a lifetime solving problems before they grew teeth. A small tin of ointment, gauze, a bottle of antiseptic, a packet of goat milk powder, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, a thermos of stew. Jake stared. "Why do you have all that?" Maggie shrugged. "Because winter doesn't ask permission before it takes things." She nodded toward Shadow and Blaze. "Pups that young need warmth, hydration, and milk. Broth helps, but we should start them right before their guts get upset." She showed him how to mix the powder with warm water, how to test the temperature on his wrist, how to feed slowly so they didn't aspirate. Jake listened the way he used to listen to a briefing. Quiet, focused, absorbing details because details kept people alive. He held the bowl while Blaze drank, then steadied Shadow when the bigger pup tried to push in front. "Easy," Jake murmured, and to his surprise, Shadow actually eased. Maggie noticed. "You've handled dogs before." Jake's jaw tightened. "In another life." She didn't push. Instead, she pointed gently at Blaze's paws. "Their pads will crack in this cold. Rub a little oil or ointment after they eat, and keep them off the porch unless you're with them." "Why?" Jake asked, though part of him already knew. Maggie's gaze shifted toward the window, toward the dark line of trees. "Old snares," she said. "Poachers used to run lines out here years back. Most are gone, but metal doesn't rot the way people do. Storms uncover things that should stay buried." The words hit Jake like a cold wave. Storms uncover things. He thought of the paw-prints that ended at his door, thought of the things he'd buried in silence. Maggie set a small, battered handheld radio on the table. Army green, scuffed, practical. "This reaches my place if the weather isn't murderous. Keep it on. If anything happens, anything, you call." Jake stared at the radio as if it was heavier than it looked. "I don't." "Yes, you do," Maggie cut in gently. "Not harsh, just certain. You don't get to play ghost out here and pretend the mountains won't notice." For a moment, the only sound was Blaze lapping milk and the stove's steady crackle. Shadow curled closer to Jake's boot, eyes half-lidded but still angled toward the door. Maggie rose and pulled her scarf tighter. "I'll check in again tomorrow," she said. "In the meantime, keep them close, especially the little one. Curious pups make fast mistakes." She paused at the doorway, then glanced back at Jake. "You did the right thing opening that door." Jake didn't answer. He watched her step off the porch and disappear into the pale morning light. When the cabin fell quiet again, it wasn't the old silence. It was the kind that waited. Jake knelt by the puppies, rubbing ointment into their pads the way Maggie showed him. Blaze wriggled, then settled, already trusting his hands. Shadow leaned into Jake's knee like he'd decided where he belonged. Jake's eyes drifted to the tree line beyond the window. Somewhere out there, under snow and years, were traps meant to take life. He reached for his coat, not to run from the storm, to make sure it didn't take anything else. The warning Maggie left behind didn't fade. It waited. Jake's chest tightened with a dread he knew too well. The moment you realize something is missing and time has teeth. He pulled on his boots without lacing them fully and went straight to the hearth. Shadow was already up, standing rigid beside the stove like a tiny soldier. His ears were pricked toward the door, body angled as if blocking an invisible threat. Blaze, usually the first to wobble over on clumsy legs, wasn't under the jacket. He wasn't behind the chair. He wasn't tucked beneath the table where the heat pooled. "Blaze?" Jake kept his voice low, like volume might scare the pup back into hiding. He checked the pantry. He checked the corner near the stacked firewood. He crouched and looked under the cot even though Blaze barely fit there. Nothing. No scrape of nails, no huff, no squeaky protest. Shadow let out a short whine and pawed at the door. Jake's stomach dropped. He crossed to the window and wiped a circle in the frost with his sleeve. Fresh snow had dusted the porch overnight, just enough to keep a record. 2 sets of paw-prints marked the boards. One set stayed close, pacing in tight loops like a guard on patrol. The other wandered. Small, uneven tracks led off the porch and down toward the trees. "No," Jake breathed, and it came out like a plea to the air. He reached for the handheld radio Maggie had left on the table, thumb hovering over the button. Pride flared, stupid, automatic, and then died under the image of a puppy disappearing into white woods. He clipped the radio to his belt. He grabbed his gloves, hesitated, then shoved them into his pocket instead. If there was wire out there, he'd need his fingers. Shadow pressed against his shin, trembling with urgency. "Find him," Jake said, and the command surprised him with how natural it sounded. Shadow shot through the door the moment Jake opened it, nose down, tail stiff. The cold hit like a slap, clean and vicious. The storm had quieted, but the world was still locked in winter's grip. Trees bowed under snow, the sky a pale steel that promised more. Jake followed the tracks, boots crunching, breath slicing out in white bursts. The prints were easy at first, shallow impressions where Blaze's paws had slipped and recovered. Then they veered off the packed path toward the darker timber. Jake's mind ran 2 timelines at once, what the tracks said and what his instincts screamed. A curious pup, a scent, a movement in brush, one wrong step. Maggie's words echoed with a chill. Old snares. Metal doesn't rot. Shadow slowed at the tree line, sniffing hard, zigzagging in short bursts, then locking onto a straight line like he'd found a scent trail. Jake kept up as best he could, weaving between trunks, scanning the ground for anything that didn't belong. Thin arcs, unnatural loops, the faint glint of wire beneath snow. He caught himself counting his breaths. In, out, in, out. It was something he did before a breach, before a climb, before the moment you chose action over fear. Out here, the enemy wasn't human. It was hidden and silent. A faint sound cut through the forest, so small Jake almost missed it. A whimper. Shadow barked once, sharp and urgent, and bolted ahead. Jake ran after him, slipping once on packed snow, catching himself on a low branch. The whimper came again, weaker, like it was running out of strength. Then he saw it. A low mound near a fallen log where the snow had collapsed into a shallow dip. Shadow was pawing frantically at the edge, whining as if he could dig his brother out through sheer will. Jake dropped to his knees and brushed snow aside. Blaze lay half buried, eyes glassy with pain, chest fluttering in quick, shallow breaths. His right hind leg was caught in a rusted snare, old wire cinched tight into fur and skin. A dark stain had spread beneath him, freezing at the edges into a cruel black lace against the white. Jake's vision narrowed. For a heartbeat, he wasn't in Wyoming. He was kneeling on rock and dust somewhere far away, staring at blood where it didn't belong, hearing radios crackle with voices that couldn't bring anyone back. "Not this," he said aloud, and it sounded like an order. He reached for the wire, but the loop was buried under Blaze's fur and the cold had turned the metal stubborn. He yanked his gloves out and shoved them into his coat, ignoring the bite of air on bare fingers. The sting was immediate, sharp, burning, but pain was useful. Pain kept him present. "Easy, buddy," Jake murmured, leaning close so Blaze could hear him. "Stay with me. Stay with me." Blaze tried to pull back and cried out once, a thin sound that ripped through Jake's chest. Shadow pressed against Blaze's shoulder, nose nudging him gently, as if offering his own warmth. Jake found the twist where the wire met the old release knot. His hands shook, not from cold alone. He forced his breathing steady, just like Maggie would tell him to do later, and worked the metal apart millimeter by millimeter. The wire resisted, then gave a fraction. "Come on," Jake whispered, jaw clenched. "Come on." Another tug. A reluctant snap. The loop loosened just enough for him to slide it off Blaze's leg. Blaze went limp against the snow, still breathing but barely. Jake didn't waste a second. He scooped the puppy up, pressing him against his chest, and wrapped his coat around him like a shield. With his free hand, he applied pressure to the wound the way he'd done 100 times in training. Firm, steady, no panic. Shadow paced in tight circles, frantic energy spilling off him, then returned to Jake's side and stayed there, head tilted up as if begging Jake to move faster. "I've got you," Jake said, and he didn't know if he meant Blaze or himself. The return to the cabin felt longer than the entire walk out. Every step jostled Blaze, and Jake adjusted his hold to keep the injured leg protected. His fingers were numb now, red and stiff, but he refused to let go. He talked the whole way, a low stream of words meant to tether Blaze to the world. "Hold on, we're almost there. You're stubborn, remember? You don't get to quit." When the cabin finally came into view, Jake half stumbled up the porch steps and shoved the door open with his shoulder. Heat hit his face, then the smell of smoke and stew and the life he'd been building in small increments. He laid Blaze on the blanket by the stove and worked fast. Warm water, clean cloth, pressure. The bleeding slowed, but the leg looked angry and swollen, fur matted. Infection, frostbite, shock. A list of threats stacked up in his mind like targets. He reached for the radio with shaking fingers and pressed the button. "Maggie," he said, voice rough. "Maggie, do you copy?" Static hissed, then her voice broke through, faint but steady like a line thrown across rushing water. "Jake, I hear you." Relief hit so hard his knees almost buckled. "Blaze, he got caught in a snare. He's bleeding. I got it off, but—" Jake swallowed. "I need help." "I'm coming," Maggie said immediately. No questions first, no judgment. "Keep him warm. Keep pressure on the wound. Don't pull the leg straight. Just let it rest where it wants to. You hear me?" "I hear you," Jake answered, and meant more than the words. He knelt beside Blaze, one hand on the puppy's rib cage, feeling that fragile rise and fall. Shadow curled in close, nose pressed to Blaze's neck, refusing to move. Jake stared at his own hands, raw, trembling, stained faintly red, and felt the old familiar guilt try to climb up his throat. If you were 1 minute later. Outside, somewhere in the distance, an engine began to growl through the snow. And Jake realized something that scared him more than the storm ever could. He didn't just want these dogs to live. He needed them to. Blaze didn't die, but the cabin felt like it had been cracked open anyway. Jake's hands wouldn't stop shaking, not from cold, but from the sick relief of almost too late. He fed the stove another log and kept his palm pressed to the bandage as if pressure alone could rewrite the morning. The sound of an engine finally cut through the hush outside, low, steady, purposeful. Jake didn't move from Blaze's side until the porch boards creaked and the door swung open. Maggie Collins stepped in with a gust of snow at her heels and a canvas medical kit slung over one shoulder. Goggles pushed up onto her forehead, cheeks flushed pink from the ride, silver braid dusted with ice crystals. She took one look at Blaze and didn't waste a single word on shock. "Show me," she said, already kneeling. Jake shifted aside, keeping Blaze close to the stove. Shadow lifted his head and gave a protective, warning rumble that sounded too big for his small body. Maggie didn't recoil. She extended 2 gloved fingers for Shadow to sniff, then spoke in the same calm tone you'd use for a skittish horse. "Hey, soldier, I'm here to help him." Shadow's ears twitched. He didn't relax exactly, but he allowed her closer, pressing his nose to Blaze's shoulder as if anchoring him. Maggie opened the kit with practiced hands. Inside were neatly wrapped rolls of gauze, antiseptic, a small jar of salve, a pair of trauma shears, and a narrow flashlight. She moved with the kind of confidence that didn't come from theory. "Old snare," she muttered after one glance at the wound. "Poacher line from years back. Storms uncover them. That's why I warned you." Jake's jaw flexed. "I should have kept him inside." "You did what you could," Maggie said, and her voice didn't soften in pity, just steadied into truth. "Now, we do the next right thing." She warmed a little water on the stove, then cleaned the wound carefully, wiping away frozen blood and grit. Blaze whimpered once, then went quiet, eyes half closing. Maggie checked his toes, rubbed circulation back into the paw with her thumb, and watched the color return in slow increments. "He's lucky," she said. "And so are you." Jake's throat worked. Lucky isn't the word I'd use. Maggie glanced up at him, and the look she gave could have pinned a storm cloud to the sky. "You got the snare off. You kept pressure. You called. That's not luck, Jake. That's action." Jake swallowed. He went limp in my arms. "Shock," she replied. "Pain. Cold. Puppies don't dramatize it the way people do. They just endure." She taped fresh gauze in place and wrapped the leg snug, but not tight. "We'll change it daily. Keep it dry. Keep him warm. No running. No wandering." Blaze's eyelids fluttered. Shadow nudged him gently, then rested his chin beside the bandage like he was standing watch over a wound in a war zone. Maggie's gaze flicked to Jake's fingers. They were raw and reddened, skin split in fine lines from tearing off gloves in the snow. She reached into her kit and slid a small tin across the floor. "Put that on your hands," she said. Jake didn't move at first. Maggie lifted her eyebrows. "Don't be stubborn. You'll crack and bleed the next time you need to grip something." The next time. The words landed like a weight. Jake opened the tin, rubbed salve into his knuckles, and felt the sting fade into warmth. Maggie sat back on her heels. "How long was he out there?" Jake stared at Blaze's chest rising and falling. "I don't know. 10 minutes? 20? It felt like—" He cut himself off. "Like forever," Maggie supplied. Jake's mouth tightened. "Like I've lived that moment before." Maggie didn't pretend not to understand. She wiped her hands on a cloth and leaned slightly closer, voice lower now, less instructor and more witness. "I heard you were a Navy SEAL," she said. "Folks in town talk. They always do." Jake looked away. "Talking is easy. Living with it isn't," Maggie said. Then, after a beat, "When you found Blaze, what did your body do?" Jake blinked, caught off guard by the question. "My heart." He paused, realizing he didn't want to admit it. "My heart went too fast. My hands shook." "And your breathing?" Maggie asked. He exhaled, sharp, "Shallow." Maggie nodded once as if confirming a diagnosis she'd seen 100 times. "Okay. Here's what we do when panic tries to drive. You don't argue with it. You steer around it." She tapped 2 fingers against the table, slow and rhythmic. "Breathe in for 4, hold for 4, out for 6. Longer exhale tells your nervous system you're not dying." Jake almost scoffed. Almost, but his lungs felt tight, and the memory of Blaze's limp body was still clawing at his ribs. Maggie demonstrated. Quiet, steady breaths like she was teaching a child to float. Jake followed. In, hold, out. The second exhale came easier than the first. The third felt like a door cracking open. "Again," Maggie said. He did it. Shadow watched him, ears tilted as if reading the shift in Jake's posture. Blaze's breathing stayed slow, sheltered by the heat and the weight of his brother's presence. Maggie reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small bundle held together by twine. She set it on the table. A notebook. Plain, cheap paper. The kind you bought at a hardware store. "What's that?" Jake asked. "A place to put the noise," Maggie said simply. "Write 1 sentence a day if that's all you can stand. Not for poetry, for proof. Proof you survived the day without losing yourself to it." Jake stared at the notebook like it was heavier than the radio. Maggie's eyes drifted to the handheld unit clipped on his belt. "Keep that on you," she added. "All the time." "I called you," Jake said. "That's enough." Maggie's mouth twitched. "No. That's a start. I'm giving you something more important than a radio. I'm giving you a line back to the living." Jake didn't answer. He wasn't sure he could. Maggie packed her kit, then paused at the door. "There's more out there," she said, gesturing toward the forest. "Not just snares. Winter. Accidents. Bad luck disguised as quiet mornings. You can't control all of it, but you can prepare." Jake's eyes went to Blaze. "I don't want him out there again." "Then you train him," Maggie said. "And you train yourself. Small steps. Routine. Boundaries." She looked down at Shadow. "And you. Keep doing what you're doing. You're a good brother." Shadow thumped his tail once, solemn as a vow. When Maggie stepped onto the porch, the air felt colder without her certainty in it. Jake watched her snowmobile disappear between the trees, a fading hum swallowed by the valley. Then he shut the door and stood in the warm hush, listening. Blaze slept, bandage bright against his dark fur. Shadow stayed pressed to him like a shield. Jake sat at the table and opened the notebook. He wrote 1 sentence, slow and blunt, like a report. Blaze came home. Outside, the light shifted. Clouds thickened over the ridge, moving in with that heavy, deliberate pace that made Jake's skin prickle. He glanced at the window, then at the radio on his belt. A burst of static cracked through the speaker. Brief, ugly, then gone. Jake froze. He pressed the button, tested the channel. For a moment, nothing answered but hiss. He looked at Shadow, then at Blaze's sleeping face and felt the old mission sense rising again. Quiet, cold, undeniable. Somewhere out there, the weather was changing. And if the radio went dead, Maggie would be alone on the other side of the ridge. The radio's static didn't just cut the air, it cut the fragile sense of safety Jake had been building. Fear hit fast, sharp, and personal. He clipped the unit tighter to his belt, grabbed his pack, and went for the door. Outside, the valley was already changing color, gray folding into white. Wind skimmed the snow in low, angry sheets, erasing edges, smoothing the world into something blank and dangerous. Jake squinted toward the ridge that separated his cabin from Maggie's place. In clear weather, he could make out the faint line of her fence. Today, it was a rumor. "Stay," he told the dogs, voice firm, the kind of tone that used to stop men in their tracks. Shadow didn't move until Jake stepped onto the porch. Then the pup was at his heel like the command meant the opposite. Blaze limped up behind, bandaged leg tucked close, eyes bright with defiance. Jake swore under his breath. "You're not ready," he muttered at Blaze. Blaze gave a tiny, offended huff. Shadow pressed his shoulder against Blaze's side as if to brace him. Jake exhaled hard. "Fine, but you stick close. No heroics." The wind answered with a gust that slapped snow into his face. He turned into it anyway. He moved by landmarks more than sight, tree clusters, a broken stump, the shape of rock outcroppings he'd memorized from months of solitude. The storm thickened fast. It wasn't the gentle kind that drifted down like quiet. This was a wall, a living thing that shoved and blinded and tried to turn you around. Jake checked the radio every few minutes. "Maggie," he said into it. "Maggie, do you copy?" Static. Then nothing. He adjusted the frequency. Tried again. Nothing. His jaw locked. The last time he'd heard nothing in his ear, men had disappeared behind a ridge and never reappeared. That memory tried to rise up and choke him. He forced it down with breath, 4 in, hold, 6 out, then kept walking. Shadow trotted ahead, nose low, navigating with scent where Jake had only whiteness. Blaze stayed glued to Jake's left side, limping but stubborn, refusing to fall behind. The pup's bandage was wrapped tight and clean, but the wind worried at it like it wanted to test every stitch of recovery. Halfway up the ridge, the gusts hit harder. Snow spiraled in a violent curtain. Jake lowered his head and pushed through, one step at a time, boots sinking to mid-calf. The cold found the seams in his clothes and slid in like water. Then Shadow stopped abruptly. He barked once, short, urgent, and angled off the path. Jake's first instinct was frustration. Not now, but Shadow didn't bark like he'd spotted a rabbit. He barked like something was wrong. Jake followed, fighting through thigh-high drift until he saw the shape half buried near a stand of firs, a lump that didn't belong to the landscape. At first he thought it was a fallen log. Then the log shifted, and 2 tired eyes opened. A dog, larger than Shadow by far, thick golden coat matted with ice and dirt, ribs showing, one ear torn like it had been caught on wire. A frayed rope still hung from its neck, stiff with frost, as if it had broken free from a tie-out and run until its body couldn't run any more. The dog tried to lift its head and failed, a low, cracked whine escaping its throat. Jake crouched beside it. The animal's breath was shallow, little puffs that looked too small for a body that big. Its paws were pale at the edges, pads cracked, the beginnings of frostbite. Blaze hobbled closer and sniffed the dog's muzzle, tail wagging once, gentle, encouraging, like he was offering membership in the only family he knew. Shadow circled, alert, then stood guard at Jake's shoulder. Jake stared toward the ridge again. He couldn't see Maggie's farmhouse. Only white, only wind. The logical choice was to keep moving. Maggie was alone. Radio was dead. If her stove went out, if her roof gave, if she slipped and couldn't get up, there were 100 ways winter finished a story. But the dog at Jake's feet wasn't a later problem. It was a now problem. And Jake knew the truth about now. It didn't wait politely. He slid his hands under the dog's chest and tried to lift. The animal was heavier than it looked, dead weight from cold and exhaustion. Jake grunted, shifted his stance, and hauled it up across his shoulders in a fireman's carry the way he'd done with teammates and strangers and anyone who couldn't walk. The dog sagged against him, too weak to resist, trusting because it had no other choice. "All right," Jake growled into the storm. "You're coming too." The wind tried to shove him sideways. Jake leaned into it, hunched, shielding the dog's head with his own body. Shadow and Blaze flanked him, ghost shapes in the swirling white. Time lost meaning. There was only breath and distance and the burning in his thighs. When the farmhouse finally appeared, it wasn't a comforting sight. It looked battered, half-buried roofline, drifts piled against the porch, chimney smoke faint and uneven. Jake climbed the steps and slammed his shoulder into the door. It opened on the first try, like Maggie had left it unlatched in case the world came to her instead. Inside, the air was dim and thick with cold smoke. The stove was burning, but weakly. Frost filmed the inside of the window panes like the house was freezing from within. Maggie sat near the stove, wrapped in a blanket, posture upright but pale around the mouth, eyes steady in a face that didn't want to admit worry. The moment she saw Jake, her expression cracked, relief and exasperation colliding. "Jake," she breathed. "I thought—" "You weren't answering," he cut in, voice rough, hauling the golden dog down carefully onto a rug near the stove. "Radio's dead." "The wind took the tower," Maggie said, already pushing herself up. She swayed once, caught the chair, then steadied. "I was waiting it out. Stupid plan, I know, but the drifts were—" "Save it," Jake said, but there was no real anger in it, just the leftover edge of fear. "Help me." Maggie dropped to her knees beside the new dog, hands moving with that same calm authority she'd brought to Blaze. She checked gums, lifted eyelids, pressed fingers to the pads. "Male," she murmured. "Dehydrated, frostbite starting on the paws, rope burns on the neck." Her jaw tightened. Somebody tied him up and left him. He didn't just get lost. Jake's stomach turned. He glanced at the frayed rope again and imagined a post, a yard, a decision made by someone who didn't want to deal with the cost of another living thing. Maggie looked up at him. "You carried him in this?" Jake shrugged out of his pack, hands trembling now that he'd stopped moving. "Found him on the ridge." "You don't know how to stay inside when the world falls apart," Maggie said, and the line could have been scolding, if her eyes hadn't been soft with something like pride. Jake gave a thin, tired half-smile. "You're late." Maggie snorted once. "You pull a half-frozen dog out of a whiteout and suddenly you've got jokes." They worked in quiet rhythm. Maggie warmed water and bathed the dog's paws, rubbing circulation back in with slow pressure. Jake fed the stove until the flames rose stronger, then found towels and wrapped them hot around the animal's legs. Shadow curled near Blaze by the hearth, keeping watch, while Blaze, despite his bandage, dragged himself closer to the new dog and rested his chin against its shoulder like an offering. The golden dog shuddered, then let out a low whine. Its eyes opened wider, tracking the room. "Easy," Jake said automatically, and the word startled him with how often it belonged to him now. "You're safe." The dog's head dropped, not fully relaxed but no longer fighting. Maggie leaned back, wiping her hands. "He's a fighter," she said. "He needs a name." Jake stared at the dog's coat, golden, storm-tossed, still glittering with melting ice. Then he glanced at the windows, at the white chaos beyond. "Storm," he said. Maggie's mouth curved. "Fitting." Night pressed on, the wind battering the house like it wanted to break in and take inventory. But inside, heat grew. Real heat, fed by wood and motion and shared purpose. Jake fixed a loose latch on the back door. Maggie brewed coffee. At some point, without anyone announcing it, the fear loosened its grip. Near dawn, the storm finally began to ease. The wind softened from a roar to a long sigh. Snow fell slower, heavier, like the world was settling back into itself. Jake stood at the window and watched the first pale light smear across the ridge. Behind him, Storm slept near the stove, breathing steadier. Blaze slept pressed against Shadow. Maggie sat at the table, hands around a mug, her eyes on Jake like she was measuring something he couldn't see. "You didn't just bring a dog in here," she said quietly. You brought life back into this room." Jake didn't turn around right away. His throat felt tight for reasons that had nothing to do with cold. He started. "You just chose," Maggie finished. "In a storm, you chose." Jake finally looked at the 3 dogs curled in the warm light. Shadow vigilant even in sleep, Blaze stubbornly alive, Storm rescued from somebody else's cruelty, and felt something shift deep in his chest. Not peace exactly, but direction. Outside, the valley was still buried, still harsh, still dangerous. But for the first time, Jake wasn't thinking about running from it. He was thinking about building something that could stand in it. The storm left the ridge scarred with drifts and snapped branches, but it left something else behind, too. A tether. Jake felt it in the quiet that followed. Less hollow, more held. He stepped outside at first light and began clearing snow from the back lot, one shovel width at a time. Early spring in the valley didn't arrive with warmth. It arrived with surrender. Thin sunlight, softer wind, the first wet smell of thawed earth seeping up through ice. The roof still shed chunks of snow some mornings, and the creek behind the cabin groaned under its own waking. But the world was changing, and Jake couldn't ignore what had changed inside his cabin. Storm recovered slowly, like a dog learning how to trust a room again. His paws stayed tender for days, pads cracked and pink where frostbite had tried to claim them. Jake watched him the way he watched weather, attentive, patient, ready to intervene. He warmed towels by the stove and wrapped Storm's feet, massaged salve into the raw spots, and fed him small meals so his stomach didn't revolt. Storm didn't play at first. He didn't chase anything. He simply lay where Jake could be seen, eyes half open, tracking every movement like he was waiting for the moment safety disappeared. Shadow and Blaze made sure it didn't. Shadow became a quiet wall between Storm and the door, always positioned like a sentry. Blaze, still favoring that healed leg on cold mornings, was the opposite. Shameless, hopeful, persistent. He brought Storm chewed sticks like offerings. He climbed into Storm's space without permission, pressed his head against Storm's shoulder, and refused to accept rejection as permanent. Day by day, Storm's posture softened. The stiff guard in his neck loosened. The panic in his eyes dulled into cautious calm. Jake noticed the change the way you notice a fire catching. First you doubt it'll hold, then suddenly the flame is real. Maggie came by whenever the road allowed, never making a fuss about it, never asking permission twice. She'd appear with a basket or a sack, antibiotic ointment, extra gauze, goat milk powder Jake still used as a safety net, and once a coil of rope and a pair of heavy gloves. "You're going to keep walking out into weather," she said, tossing the gloves onto the table, "so you might as well stop shredding your hands." Jake almost argued. Instead, he put the gloves on. They fit like a quiet concession. A week after the second blizzard, Maggie stood on the porch with her hands in her coat pockets, studying the space behind Jake's cabin, the small hollow where the trees opened into a shallow bowl, sheltered from the worst wind. "You can't keep bringing every wounded thing into your kitchen," she said. Jake glanced back at the doorway where 3 dogs now treated his cabin like home. "Wasn't planning to make a habit of it." Maggie's eyes narrowed in amusement. "Too late. Habits already formed." She nodded toward the hollow. "You need something out there. Not a shelter. A place between wild and warm. Somewhere to dry out, heal, regain strength." Jake's first instinct was to reject it. Anything that sounded like commitment made his ribs tighten. Then he looked at Blaze's bandaged past, at Storm's rope-burned neck, at Shadow's constant watchfulness, and realized the truth. Commitment had already been forced into his arms the moment he opened the door. So he built. He started with what he knew: structure, function, durability. He cleared the hollow down to packed earth and dragged old boards from a collapsed shed line. He cut new lumber with a saw that bit through wood like it was eager to be useful again. He hammered until his shoulders burned and his mind went quiet in the best way. Quiet like focus, not like emptiness. Shadow followed every movement like a foreman. Blaze helped by stealing nails and forcing Jake into reluctant chases. Storm carried scraps of wood in his mouth once his strength returned, tail wagging with something that looked suspiciously like pride. Maggie showed up with a paint can and a brush, as if this had been scheduled between them without either admitting it. "Words matter," she said, dipping the brush. "If you're making a haven, name it." Jake watched her hand move, steady, old-fashioned, sure. She painted on a slab of pine he'd sanded down smooth, Haven Hollow. He didn't have a speech for what it did to him, seeing that name take form. He just swallowed and went back to work. The sanctuary wasn't big. 3 simple enclosures with straw bedding, a covered lean-to against wind, and a small fire pit ringed with stone where warmth could be made without risking the cabin. Jake built it sturdy, the way he'd built trust with teammates. Slow, tested, honest. Then something strange started happening. One morning, Jake found a bundle of blankets folded neatly on the edge of the hollow, protected beneath a tarp weighed down by 2 stones. No footprints he could see, just the offering, clean and dry. Another day, a sack of dog food sat beside the Haven Hollow sign with a handwritten note on torn paper. For the dogs, and for whoever keeps them alive. Jake held the note a long time, thumb rubbing the edge until the paper softened. He didn't know what to do with anonymous kindness. In war, you knew where help came from. Here it just appeared, quiet as snowfall, stubborn as blaze. He posted nothing, asked no questions. He simply stored the supplies, repaired a loose hinge on the enclosure, and kept working. By the time the snow began to melt in thin streams instead of heavy sheets, Haven Hollow looked like it belonged, like it had always been waiting under the surface of that land for hands to shape it. That was the day the envelope arrived. It came with the mail carrier, who only braved the valley when the roads were passable, an older man with wind-cracked skin and a cap pulled low. He handed Jake a thick, cream-colored envelope and nodded once like he could feel the weight of it without reading a word. "Came through a veteran's office," the man said. "Looks official." Jake's fingers went numb in a way the cold had nothing to do with. The seal stamped on the flap wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. The insignia alone was enough to pull the cabin out from under him for a second, enough to drag the smell of dust and metal and aircraft fuel into a place that smelled like pine and stew. Shadow sat at Jake's boot, gaze fixed on the envelope. Blaze bounced once, curious, then quieted as if the paper itself had changed the air. Storm watched from the porch, head tilted. Jake didn't open it right away. He carried it inside and set it on the table beside the tarnished seal trident coin. 2 artifacts from different lives suddenly staring at each other. When he finally slid a knife under the flap, his hands were careful, too careful, like he was diffusing something. The letter was from Commander Michael Hayes. Hayes had been his superior, a man with a voice like gravel and eyes that missed very little, the kind of officer who didn't waste praise, but didn't abandon his people either. Jake hadn't heard from him in years, not since the last debriefs, the quiet paperwork, the unspoken understanding that Jake needed distance from everything that wore a uniform. The letter was brief. Formal at first, then turning personal in the middle like Hayes couldn't help himself. A rehabilitation program. K-9 work integrated with veteran recovery. Dogs trained not for combat, but for companionship, grounding, rescue support, purpose without blood. Hayes wrote that they needed someone who understood both ends of the leash, someone who'd been on the edge and didn't pretend otherwise. Jake read it once, then again, then a third time, slower, like the words might change if he stared hard enough. A lead instructor position. Denver. A facility. A return to structure. A return to people. His stomach tightened. The old part of him, the part that still woke at night expecting alarms, felt pulled toward it like gravity. The newer part of him, the part that had learned the sound of puppies breathing by the stove, felt protective, stubborn, unwilling to be uprooted. He folded the letter and set it down. The room was quiet except for the stove and 3 sets of paws shifting on wood. Jake stared at the envelope, then at the Haven Hollow sign leaning near the wall, paint still fresh in places. He had built something that didn't exist before. Now his past was asking him to step back into a world he'd fled. Outside, dusk began to gather in pale blue layers over the hollow. The wind carried the faint smell of meltwater and pine. Jake clipped Maggie's radio to his belt out of habit, then stopped, realizing he hadn't even noticed he was doing it. A mission sense rose in him, sharp and uneasy. Not the kind that sends you into gunfire, the kind that asks you to choose who you are now. Hayes's letter stayed on the table like a live round. Jake felt the old world pressing at the cabin walls, heavy and familiar, like a rucksack he'd sworn he'd never shoulder again. He folded the paper tight and slid it into his pocket, then went outside to split wood just to hear something obey him. The axe bit clean through pine, the crack sharp in the cold air. Shadow watched from the edge of Haven Hollow, posture steady, eyes tracking Jake's shoulders and hands as if he could tell when the past was trying to crawl back in. Blaze limped in a loose circle, bored with stillness, then settled by Storm's front paws. Storm lay with his chin down, golden coat thickening in the thaw, but his eyes stayed alert, always measuring exits, always remembering what a rope around the neck meant. Jake swung again. The rhythm should have calmed him. It usually did, but today each strike landed with a second sound underneath it, the echo of a bass corridor, the metallic taste of old adrenaline, the quiet voice in his head that said, "You could go back. You could make it mean something." He didn't want to go back. He wanted to stop feeling like every doorway led to another loss. That night he tried to sleep and failed. He lay on the cot with the lantern turned low, listening to the stove settle and the wind skim the roof. Shadow curled near the door like a lock. Blaze slept pressed against Storm's side, as if warmth could be shared like a promise. Jake stared at the ceiling beams until his eyes burned, then sat up and pulled the letter from his pocket. Commander Michael Hayes. The name alone carried a weight. Hayes had been the kind of leader who didn't talk about feelings, but he did notice when your hands started shaking after an op. He'd lost part of his hearing in an explosion overseas. Jake remembered the way Hayes would tilt his head slightly to catch words, the way he'd stare directly at you so he could read the rest from your face. A hard man, but not a careless one. The letter was short. Rehab program. Veterans. K-9 work. Purpose. And then the line that dug under Jake's skin. We need someone who understands both sides of that leash. Jake read that sentence 3 times, then set the paper down beside his sealed trident coin. 2 symbols. 2 versions of him. Neither one offering an easy answer. He stood and walked the cabin, slow and quiet, like he was clearing rooms in the dark. The habit disgusted him and comforted him at the same time. He checked the lock. He checked the window. He checked the radio Maggie had given him. Battery full, channel set, ready. Then he stopped in the middle of the room and realized he wasn't scared of the storm. He was scared of being needed again. Morning arrived pale and cold, the sky washed thin like old steel. Maggie knocked just after sunrise, the sound soft but confident, like she already knew the door would open. Jake let her in without a word. She took one look at his face and didn't ask how he slept. She didn't need to. "You got a letter," she said. Jake's shoulders stiffened. "News travels fast." Maggie set her basket on the table. "Out here news travels the way weather does, quiet until it's on top of you." She glanced at the envelope. "From him?" Jake nodded once. "Hayes." Maggie didn't touch the paper. She didn't have to. "What does he want?" Jake exhaled. "A program. K-9 rehab for vets. In Denver." He hated how the city name sounded in his mouth. Too many people, too many walls, too many chances to feel cornered. Lead instructor. Maggie's eyebrows lifted slightly. "And what do you want?" Jake laughed once, sharp and humorless. I want him to stop asking me to be who I was." Maggie's gaze softened, but her voice stayed steady. "He's not asking you to be who you were. He's asking you to be useful." Jake looked away. "Useful is what got people killed." "That's not fair," Maggie said gently. "Not to you, not to them." Silence stretched. Shadow stood up and came to Jake's knee, leaning his shoulder into Jake's leg like an anchor. Jake rested a hand on the pup's head without thinking. "I trained dogs for war," Jake said, quieter now. "I don't want them near that world again." Maggie nodded as if she'd been waiting for the truth under the anger. "Then don't train them for war." Jake blinked. Maggie stepped closer, eyes steady. "Train them for rescue, for steadiness, for companionship, for grounding." She nodded toward Blaze. "That one learned endurance in a snare. Shadow learned vigilance in a storm. Storm learned survival after cruelty. Those aren't combat lessons, Jake. Those are healing lessons." Jake swallowed. "Hayes wants me there." Maggie's mouth curved, small, knowing. "Hayes wants the work done, not the zip code." She paused. "You think purpose only lives behind a fence with a uniform on the gate?" Jake stared at her. Maggie tapped the Haven Hollow sign leaning near the wall. "You already built the beginning of a program. You just haven't admitted it yet. The idea landed hard, because it was true. The routine he'd built for the dogs, the patience, the consistency, the way he'd learned to speak with his hands instead of disappearing, wasn't just care. It was training. The kind that didn't break you down. The kind that built you back up." Jake walked to the table, pulled the notebook Maggie had given him closer, and opened to a clean page. He didn't write a diary entry. He wrote a plan. Simple headings, blunt like a checklist. Basics, bond, trust, commands, calm under stress, recovery drills, night routine, handler breathing. Maggie watched without interrupting. Then Jake stood, grabbed a scrap of wood from the corner, and set it on the table. He found Maggie's paint and brush. His hands hovered for a moment, like the words mattered enough to be dangerous. They did. He painted slowly, letters blocky and sure. Veteran K9 Program. Haven Hollow not to fight, but to heal. When he finished, he set the brush down and stared at the sign until his eyes stung. Maggie exhaled softly. "There," she said. "That's you choosing?" Jake's jaw tightened. "I still have to answer him." "You will," Maggie said, "and you'll tell him the truth. You're not refusing the work. You're redefining it." Jake nodded once, the motion small but final. He folded Hayes's letter, wrote a short response on clean paper. No excuses, no drama. Just direction. He would run the program from here. He would send updates. He would invite Hayes to see it when the roads allowed. That evening, the cabin felt different. Not louder, not crowded, just oriented. Jake hung the new sign near the door where the old Trident coin used to sit alone. Shadow lay beneath it, facing the entrance like he understood the assignment. Blaze slept with his healed leg stretched out, relaxed. Storm sighed and settled near the hearth, finally sleeping deep enough to dream. Jake sat in the dim firelight with his notebook open, pen resting between his fingers. The wind outside was gentle tonight, almost respectful. He wrote one sentence. "I'm not going back. I'm building forward." Then, just after midnight, the air shifted. A soft scrape touched the door. Once. Then again, fragile, hesitant, like something too small to knock. The sound at the door didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a memory coming back to test whether it still had power. Jake's breath caught anyway. His pulse jumped, then steadied as he forced a long exhale, the way Maggie taught him. Shadow was up instantly, silent but ready, body angled toward the entry like a living lock. Storm lifted his head, ears twitching, eyes tracking the doorknob. Blaze pushed himself upright, bandaged leg tucked close, and let out a low, uncertain huff. Not aggression, just recognition. The same sound he'd made the first night he survived. Jake didn't freeze this time. He moved. He crossed the cabin and reached for the small protocol corner he'd built without calling it that. A plastic bin with towels, a spare blanket, a shallow bowl, goat milk powder, and a hot water bottle wrapped in cloth. Preparation had become a kind of faith, proof he believed the world could send life to his door again. Another scrape. Jake set the bin by the stove, then walked back and unlatched the bolt. He paused with his palm on the wood, feeling the cold seeping through the grain. Outside, the air hummed with late-season snow, soft and thick. The world was quiet in that eerie way it got before dawn, when even the trees seemed to hold their breath. He opened the door. Cold slid in, sharp but not violent. Snowflakes drifted like ash in slow motion. And on the porch, two tiny shapes huddled together. German shepherd puppies, barely 6 weeks old, fur clumped with snow, eyes wide with the same pleading stubbornness Jake had seen months ago. For a heartbeat, it was like time folded. The darker one, slightly bigger, ears half raised, stood in front, shaking hard but refusing to sit. The smaller one pressed tight against its sibling, tan paws buried in fresh powder, a faint scar visible over one ear when it lifted its head. They looked up at Jake as if they'd reached the end of the world and found one last chance. Jake crouched. "Hey," he murmured, voice softer than he would have allowed himself once. "You're okay. You're okay." The bigger pup took one step forward and faltered. The smaller pup lifted a paw and placed it on Jake's boot like it was asking permission. That tiny touch hit Jake in the chest harder than any letter from Hayes ever could. Behind him, Shadow moved to the threshold. He lowered his head, sniffed the puppies carefully, then released a low rumble. Not warning, not fear, something protective. Blaze limped up beside Shadow and sat, tail wagging in slow, steady sweeps as if to say, "We know what this is. We've been here. You're safe now." Storm stood just behind them, broad and golden, a silent sentinel. He didn't bark. He simply watched the yard and the dark beyond it, guarding the moment. Jake scooped the puppies up, one in each arm, feeling their bodies tremble like fragile engines. Their fur was ice-stiff, and the cold of them scared him the same way it had the first time. He kicked the door shut and carried them straight to the stove. Towel first. Slow rubbing. Warmth, not shock. He wrapped them in the blanket and pressed the hot water bottle nearby, then mixed goat milk with warm water until it was just right. The puppies drank in shaky bursts, pausing to cough, then returning like hunger was the only thing keeping them upright. Maggie's voice came from behind him, gentle and unsurprised. "Well," she said, brushing snow from her shoulders as she stepped in, "looks like the valley knows exactly where to send them." Jake glanced up. "You saw." "I heard your radio click," Maggie said, and her eyes held a soft, knowing light. "And I saw your porch light. Same as the first storm." Jake swallowed. "It's happening again?" Maggie knelt beside the pups, letting them sniff her fingers. "No," she corrected, quiet but firm. "It's continuing." Jake stared at the puppies as their shivering slowed, the warmth starting to win. Shadow lay down near them, head on his paws, watching every breath. Blaze curled close, pressing his side against the blanket like a living heater. Storm settled near the door, body angled outward, guarding the cabin's boundary with calm certainty. The scene didn't feel accidental. It felt like a pattern carved into the place itself. Haven Hollow, a name that had sounded hopeful when Maggie painted it. Now it sounded like a promise the land meant to keep. Jake looked at Maggie. "Maybe it's a sign," he said, and the words came out before he could second-guess them. Maggie's mouth curved into a small smile. "Of what?" Jake's gaze drifted to the sign he'd painted, not to fight, but to heal, hanging near the door. "That the work doesn't end," he said, "that it's not supposed to." Maggie's eyes softened. "Redemption usually isn't a one-time thing," she murmured. It's a choice you make over and over, especially on nights when it would be easier to stay numb. Jake exhaled and felt something inside him settle, something that had been restless for years. He looked around the cabin. 4 dogs now, 2 new lives breathing under a blanket, Maggie's steady hands nearby, the stove's warmth pushing back against winter's last attempts. He remembered the man he'd been on the first night, sitting alone, daring the world not to touch him. And he realized he wasn't that man anymore, because when compassion knocked this time, he didn't hesitate. He had towels ready, milk ready, a place ready, a heart ready. Outside, snow continued to fall, light and patient, covering the porch boards in a clean sheet of white. By morning, there would be new paw prints in it. 4 sets, 6 sets, maybe more one day, leading toward the only door that kept opening. And inside, Haven Hollow warmth spread the way it always did when life was welcomed in. Steady, stubborn, and real. By morning, Haven Hollow wasn't just a cabin anymore. It was a promise written in paw prints and firelight. Jake stood at the window, watching new tracks cross the fresh snow, and understood something he'd fought for years. Miracles don't arrive with sirens. They arrive small, shivering, trusting you to open the door. If this story warmed something in you, share it with someone who needs hope right now. And tell us, where are you watching from today? Drop your country in the comments. Subscribe for more true stories of rescue, faith, and quiet healing. May your home stay warm, even through the longest winter.